Like to call to order the Town Pension and Opeb Trust Oversight Committee meeting of August 21st. I have a roll call, please?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Barbara Spector.
Here.
Councilmember Mariko Sayo.
Here.
Councilmember Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Vice Mayor Steve Leonardis.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Rob Rennie.
Here. So at this time, if you could stand and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, and liberty with justice for all. Thank you. Okay, got the back to the other mic. So next on our agenda, we do have consent items. One is minutes from last time and a couple other items. Would anybody on the council wish to pull a consent item? Seeing none, would any member of the public wish to pull a consent item? Seeing nobody coming forward, I'll come back to the council for a motion. Okay.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Sack and a second by Vice Mayor Leonardis. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Looks like it passes unanimously. Verbal communications. Would any member of the public wish to address us on an item that is not on the agenda for 3 minutes? Seeing nobody coming forward, I'll close the verbal communication portion and move on to other business. First up is our agenda item number 4, review and approve the Town of Los Gatos retiree health care plan. And I'll turn it over to our Assistant Town Manager, Arn Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. Tonight with us, we have John Bartel of Bartel & Associates, who will be walking us through the presentation, which will be displayed on the screen, but you also have handouts in front of you. The healthcare valuation, this body is the sole fiduciary over those assets that reside in the 115 Trust, and the 2017 valuation, as prepared by Bartel & Associates, not only shows the data relevant for the 2017 valuation, but also has recommended assumption changes that will also be incorporated into that valuation. And so you will hear the presentation from John Bartel, accept the evaluation, and then also accept the recommended changes based on your discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Honorable Mayor. Members of the Oversight Committee, let me start out and say 2 things. Thing number 1 is, I always say this. Sometimes I think people think I'm kidding or being a little trite about it, but I am not. I promise you, it's absolutely my honor to talk with you about this. I mean that very much so. That's thing number 1. And thing number 2, it is was a pleasure when I went towards the end of last week to look for agenda item and that sort of thing on your website. You all have, for a CalPERS agency, the best website of showing the CalPERS reports, talking about definition of terms. I don't I don't know who's responsible for that, but whoever is, they're doing a wonderful job. We see that sort of thing at other agencies, but not at CalPERS agencies. It's quite nice to take a look at that. And the other comment that I'll make relative to that is when I started looking at the terminology, the definition of terms, I could not have done it as well as the terminology that you have there. It's really quite nice. So let's maybe begin. Oh, I'm just looking here. Shortly? Okay. Okay. we can easily talk through the handout. So if information gets up there, then I'll talk from. Oh, here we go. So I have those 2 agenda item topics. What I'll do is stop at the end of the OPEB conversation, but I will absolutely encourage you all as I'm going through the presentation to interrupt and ask questions. It will be much easier for me to answer questions. It'll be much easier for you to remember what the questions are as we go through this. So I'm going to go through some of these slides relatively quickly. Let's first talk about summary of your benefits. You have to an individual has to retire directly from the town under CalPERS, either a service or a disability retirement. Council members that are participating in CalPERS are also eligible for the benefit. The benefit is up to the Kaiser Bay Area single premium plus 90% of the difference between the single and whatever coverage an individual has. So you're sitting for non-Medicare eligible retirees about $1,343 for 2-party coverage and about $1,447 for family coverage. Surviving spouses, if an individual has elected a surviving spouse benefit under CalPERS, then the medical benefits continue. If they have not, medical benefits do not continue. We've prepared a June 30, 17 actuarial valuation determining your 1819 and 1920 contribution requirements. We really call that contribution requirement an actuarially determined contribution. So if you hear me refer to ADEC, it means ADEC, or actuarially determined contribution. General inflation is, we've reduced that from 3% to 2 3/4, and we're recommending a reduction in the discount rate from 7 1/4 to 6 3/4. The one thing I will comment there is that 50 basis point, 0.5% reduction is really due for 2 things. Thing number 1 is that reduction in the inflation assumption, and thing number 2 is we go out and we survey investment advisors to use use their sort of compiled capital market assumptions. Almost all investors are predicting lower investment return. And then in addition, CalPERS, you all are investing in the CalPERS CERBT Fund 1. They actually changed the investment mix from about 2/3 global equity to about 57. Combination of those things get us to that lower projected return. We've also changed our healthcare trend assumptions. It's really the growth in the premiums, if you will, going to slightly higher healthcare trend in the in the short run, lower in the very long run healthcare trend assumptions. Town's funding policy is to contribute the actuarially determined contribution on a go-forward basis. You all have been doing that plus a little bit for the past few years. When we get to the results, you're going to hear me say I am a fan of what the town is doing. I wish all of our clients were doing that or something like that. It really will position, in my opinion, you all to be in a very good place as time goes by. You're paying the unfunded liability over a 20-year period beginning with the 1920 fiscal year. So town contributions historically, if you go back to 2008-9, the contribution was about requirement, if you will. It's not really required. was about 1.8 million. You contributed 746,000. You really phased into contributing that full amount. Very reasonable approach, and you got to the point where in 14-15 your contribution was actually higher than the determined contribution, significantly higher in the 16-17 fiscal year. So if we look at your funded status, we start out with the actuarial liability. The actuarial liability is the value of benefits due to service that's already been rendered. As an actuary, I think of that as sort of a target asset value. That's the value of benefits that's already been rendered by active and retirees. And we, in the 2015 valuation, that was about $21 million. You can see it projected to 17. We were projecting 24 million. Actual was slightly higher than that, primarily due to the reduction in the discount rate. And we're projecting June 30, 18, that to grow to 26 million. And then when you look at the asset information, 8.2 million, excuse me. We projected that to be about 11.5 million. Actual was about 13.6, and we're projecting that to be 15.3 at June 30, 18. And so you can see the liability is growing faster, but the unfunded liability, because of your contribution policy, is actually declining over that period of time. So you see your funded ratio, the percentage of the liability that is taken care of by plan assets, going from about 39% to about 58%. Just as a rough comparison, that probably puts you in the top third when we look at our clients. We are unabashed advocates of pre-funding. Not all of our clients listen to us, but that probably puts you in the upper 1/3 when it comes to funded ratio, maybe even a little bit higher than that for our clients. And then the actuarially determined contribution, if we look at that June 30, 17 column for the 18-19 fiscal year, annual cost, so that's the value and benefits due to service being rendered in the current year, you're looking at 1.3 million. Amortization of the unfunded liability, 810,000. For a total of 2.1 million, and then for 1920, that 2.1 million grows to about 2.2 million because we make these calculations designed to be a percentage of pay. That 2.1 million, 2.2 million will gradually grow as the payroll is expected to grow. So that's the 14.4%. So you can see in 18-19, 20-year amortization. In 19-20, a 19-year amortization with the goal of really having the Opeb unfunded liability paid off over that period of time. When the unfunded liability is paid off does not mean your contribution will go away. It does mean that the UAAL amortization, that amortization of your unfunded actuarial accrued liability will go away, and you will only have the normal cost or service cost, what we refer to as the annual cost here, left in the contribution. So slide 8, we're projecting where we think those numbers are going to go, and you can see that 14.4% of pay designed to remain relatively flat. The trust pre-funding 2.1 million growing to about 2.7 million. Our presumption is when you put this money in, you will reimburse yourself for benefits that you're paying outside of the trust as well as administrative costs. If you don't do that, you will get to a full funding position sooner. The very last thing on OPEB we should chat about just for a moment are the new accounting requirements for the 17-18 fiscal year. There's a new accounting standard, Governmental Accounting Board Standard number 75. It replaces number 45 for your 17-18 fiscal year. It delinks the old standard, by and large, said if you contribute what the actuaries tell you to contribute, you have no liability on your financial statement. The new one says you're going to put a liability on your financial statement equal to the difference between your liability and the assets you have set aside for that. So you recognize your unfunded liability on the face of your financial statement. And if from a contribution standpoint, your policy is not to pay the contribution requested by the actuary, then the actuary has to go back and do a calculation likely resulting in a lower discount rate for you all. You have a contribution policy that you've had for a few years now. We are taking that because the council really has adopted that policy. We're taking that into account, so we are using that 6 3/4 discount rate to determine the liability. So we have sent to staff a draft of these results. So that's why this particular page is marked draft. We're just waiting for staff to review that information, make sure they don't have any questions. So we think on your financial statement, we are recommending for the 17-18 fiscal year a June 30, 17 measurement date. And if you do that, that gets to a net OPEB liability of $11.2 million, and that's the 54.9% funded status. So let's maybe pause here and make sure that you all don't have any questions about the OPEB report, and then I'd be happy to go on to talk about the CalPERS information.
Councilmember Sack.
Okay, so bear with me if this is
No
a silly
problem.
question. The last slide you just put up?
Yep.
So the measurement date is passed.
Yes, that's right.
So then this means the 13.608 is what we're carrying forward?
That's your assets that you had at June, so the liability and the fiduciary net position. So I'll call that the liability and assets. Fiduciary net position are your plan assets at the measurement date. So the accounting standard says when you're implementing this for the 17-18 fiscal year, you can have a measurement date anywhere from June 30, 17 through June 30, 18. So because we're recommending a June 30, 17 measurement, consistent, by the way, with how your CalPERS GASB 68 information is prepared, that 13.6 is your asset value at June 30, 17. My apologies, that was a really long-winded response.
But it helped clarify it, so thank you. So then our liability then moving forward that we're bringing into our next budget is the 11 million?
That's the unfunded liability. So think of that. So your total liability, so I know this is a crummy analogy, but think about it this way. Heaven forbid, my wife and I have a kid today, and we think that kid might go to college. So the liability for that kid is sort of, as the kid goes through time, what we want to do is set aside money to make sure that they're there. And so the liability is how much should we have set aside. The fiduciary net position or the plan assets is how much we have set aside. And the difference between those two is the unfunded liability. And so that's the exact same thing that's really going on here.
Okay, but is that as of what date? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
At the
because-
measurement date. It's at
So
June
as
30,
of
17.
17.
That's right.
So then, if I'm understanding you correctly, then that we had to somehow on our books show how we paid for 11 million.
Well, you're not going to show how you pay for it. What it is sort of a, I'm going to apologize in advance for using this next terminology. So if you were a private sector entity, shareholders would have a value of whatever your corporate assets are minus your assets, so your liability minus your assets. And so that 11 million is kind of a reduction to shareholder equity. You don't have to come up with it, but you're telling your stakeholders, this is something we haven't yet come up with, but we're going to have to. It's that I sort of think of it as kind of that reduction to shareholder equity in a private corporation standpoint. That help?
It does, and maybe I'm not explaining myself
Okay.
correctly. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is the measurement date.
Yes.
So I understand the unfunded liabilities moving forward.
Yeah.
But by having this measurement date, is this capturing how much should I be worried about today? Let's do that.
So let's do that. Let's go back. Let's go back to here, just for, sorry. So you might see a couple of, if you look at that June 30, 17 column, you might see a familiar number there, a couple of familiar numbers. If you look at your total liability, 24.8 million, that's the total liability on the GASB 75 number. You look at your assets, 13.6 million, that's your, fiduciary net position. Your unfunded liability, 11,168,000. It's actually a couple of $1,000s off because of a funny little quirk in the accounting standard. But by and large, your June 30, 17 unfunded liability, 11.2 million. And then if we had used June 30, 18 numbers, the actuarial value of assets or your market value of assets might have been slightly different, but we're expecting that 11.2 million to fall to about $11 million. So if for me, if you want a more current number, that $11 million number is a better number, if you will. We don't generally recommend the most current number because we are a little worried that you might not get all the information in time to file your financial statement. So by using a measurement date at the beginning of the fiscal year or at the end of the prior fiscal year, it just gives you a little bit more time. We think because of the policy you all have taken, because of we have this expectation that there's not going to be a wild swing in your numbers from one year to the next. We think with each valuation we'll be able to give you a very reasonable estimate on that number. So a taxpayer could look at the funding valuation and see what the June 30, 18 number, that will be a slightly different number than using the measurement date. The other reason we recommend that June 30, 17, because that's exactly what CalPERS does for pension purposes. So you will then have the same measurement date for pension as well as Opeb. There's no requirement that you have the same. It just, we think, makes it a little bit easier for folks to compare order of magnitude of numbers, if you will.
If I could interject, I think it would be helpful for you to go to the next slide and show the amortization payment, which is, I think, part of her question. How are we going to pay off this $11 million? And it shows $810,000 going towards that in the current year, and I think you're saying over 20 years, we will have paid it off.
That's right. It's exactly right. I'm sorry about that. I didn't pick up on that. That's exactly right.
Well, he's been around me longer, so he understands how to translate my question.
Councilmember Jensen.
Thank you. I want to go out the new accounting requirement in a different way. To me, it sounds like it's simply a reporting requirement that did not previously exist. So whereas we did not have to report it on our financial, now we do.
That's right.
And my question is, what's the practical effect? I'm not going to now have a not balanced budget. I'm not going to lose my bond rating, I'm assuming. So what's the practical effect? Is it just like a quarterly report for my stockholders that says, by the way, that's out there?
I think it's more than that, but I am, I say this a lot in answering questions. I'm not lots of things. I'm an actuary who listens to what other people say. In some ways, to talk about your bond rating, it's really the bond folks who should make that comment. What I will tell you is, all of the bond rating agencies will say they really had a very good feel for what your unfunded liability was. And so whether it was on the financial statement or not, they knew what it was. This is not a surprise to them. So I think if you talk to a bond rating analyst, they would say a couple of things. Thing number one, not a surprise to them. Thing number two, you all are, when compared to other folks, and certainly when compared with what folks were doing several years ago, you're really very much ahead of the game. My expectation would be that they would look at your funded ratio, they would look at your contribution policy, they would look at your history of making that contribution policy, and probably give you at least one thumb up, probably two thumbs up relative to what you're doing.
So I wasn't actually so much concerned about the bond rating, and I just put that in there. I just really wanted to understand that this is a reporting requirement, and it does not affect our budgeting process other than how we consider funding these things as we have in the past.
That's 100% right. The thing that does impact your budget because of your contribution policy is slide 7. It's really looking at those contribution requirements.
Thank you.
Could I bring attention to one other thing? If you go to the slide that predicts our future payments, and just wanted to clarify that this doesn't include any changes that we might make. We have last council meeting approved changes negotiated with one of our unions to eliminate any future employee, or bring it to very small number, any future employee medical payments, which should reduce these payments. And we have another second union on the consent calendar for tonight's meeting also. So these numbers will change as our contracts change.
That's 100% right. The one caution I will give you is because you're only doing it for future hires, it only changes when you hire people. So it will change very gradually, if you will, over time. But you're absolutely right. If you look out 10, 20 years, the actual numbers will almost certainly be below what we're showing here.
Okay, thank you. I guess we better keep moving along here.
Okay.
And Mayor, if you would, because you are the sole fiduciaries over this valuation and the recommended assumption changes, this would require a motion to accept the valuation and also to accept the recommendations on the assumption changes.
And are we finished with this portion of it then? So it's time to look for a motion then? Would somebody like to make a motion to approve the actuarial and assumption changes that are shown in this report?
So moved.
Do I have a second? Okay, I'll second it then. Any further discussion? Seeing none, do I need to open the verbal comment first? I probably should give, okay, would any member of the public wish to speak on this item? Seeing nobody coming forward, we'll close that, okay? And I'll go ahead and call the motion then. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Seeing none, passes unanimously. Thank you. Continue.
Right?
And just to set this conversation up for a second, why Bartel does not create the actuarial valuations for the pension plan, he is a subject matter expert, and CalPERS doesn't necessarily provide a deep dive in our valuations. And so they've performed kind of, for lack of a better term, almost a forensic analysis of the CalPERS 2016 valuation, and are going to provide us insights that they've gleaned as industry professionals about that valuation.
That's a really good description of what we do. I'm probably going to steal that, just so you know. But I'm going to make kind of a little editorial comment here that I'm not qualified to make, but I'm going to make it anyhow. For me, two things for your OPEB. You have control over it, and you have taken responsibility for it. On the CalPERS side, you have far less control. CalPERS actuaries don't ask you if they like the assumption changes. They make them. CalPERS actuaries don't like it or don't ask you if, if it's okay with you. If they change the amortization, they change it. And so you have less control, and that less control will be reflected when we take a look at how we got here from a pension standpoint and where we're going relative to contributions. So in some ways, I'm not a budget guy, but I think where your CalPERS contributions are going is a much, much bigger issue because you have way less control over it. There are some things you can do to take control, but they really are a little bit limited, if you will. So let's talk first about how we got here. You know, you can you can pick up articles, see headlines, and you'll see people blame it on benefit improvements. You'll see people go, no, benefit improvements didn't do it. It's because investment return has been particularly bad, and then somebody else will say something completely different. I actually think there are multiple reasons. I'm going to talk about them not in any order of magnitude, but just these are things you should keep in the back of your mind. Thing number one is absolutely investment returns, not just historical investment returns, both the dot-com bubble and the recession in 8 and 9, but investment advisors, every time we listen to investment advisors, they're saying be prepared for lower investment returns than we've gotten in the past. And so that's, by the way, not just true of CalPERS investment advisors. It's true, and one of the reasons why we recommended the reduction of the discount rate from 7.25 down to 6.75. Well, CalPERS is no exception there. So anticipated future returns. Thing number two are benefit enhancements around the state. Agencies enhance pension benefits, primarily for safety, but certainly for both safety and non-safety. Pre-PEPRA hires almost universally have a more valuable benefit than the PEPRA. PEPRA came into place January 1, 2013. It will take a long while for those PEPRA changes to really be reflected in your unfunded liability and your contribution. It will happen. It just will take a long time for it to happen. Thing number three is CalPERS contribution policy. So, if you were so inclined, I don't think I would say it like this, but I think a lot of people go, well, the first one is investment return. That's the folks doing the investments fault. Benefit enhancements, that it rests on the shoulders of the town. Thing number three is CalPERS contribution policy. By and large, CalPERS did not ask you to contribute enough. So this is kind of like having a loan with negative amortization. If you're not paying interest on your loan, then guess what? The balance keeps growing. And CalPERS was, generally speaking, not asking folks to contribute as much as they should. So you're going to see in another slide or two, in my opinion, CalPERS is fixing that. But you know, if you're not being asked to contribute interest on your unfunded liability, and then all of a sudden you're asked to be contributing interest plus something to pay down the principal, guess what? Your contribution has to grow. So that CalPERS contribution policy, people don't talk about that very much, but in my opinion, that's a pretty big deal. And then the fourth thing falls under the category of statement that my wife hates it whenever I say this, but it kind of is what it is. Meaning, you all have a large liability for folks who have already retired and are beginning to receive benefits. So you've been in CalPERS for a long time, you have a lot of retirees receiving benefits, and that's a large portion of the liability. And so you are not unique in this. Lots of cities and towns, counties, special purpose districts around the state sort of fall into that category. For me, that exacerbates the problem of the CalPERS contribution policy, because as you get more and more folks into retirement, if you're not paying your unfunded liability, the benefits that are due over a shorter period of time. Think about this for a second. If you're 25 years old and you're saving for your own retirement and you go, I want to start my retirement at age 65, you start making those payments 40 years from now. You don't need all the money to make those payments immediately when you retire. The closer you get to retirement, the more important it is to have that money set aside. And if 60% of your liability belongs to people who have already retired, that means you have a mature population, and it's particularly important to have that money set aside sooner rather than later. And so when you're putting off making those contributions, albeit not at your own discretion, that just makes things a little bit worse. So I would encourage you all, when you have these conversations, to talk about all four of those issues. So slide 12, I was told years ago I should never, ever make an apology as part of a presentation. Almost every presentation I make, I have an apology. Here's my apology. There's a lot of detail here. What we're doing here is these are the assumptions we're using to project where we think your contribution rates are going. And when we make those projections, we're taking into account the fact that we think CalPERS will be lowering the assumed return in future years beyond the 7% that they're dropping it to. We're taking into account the fact that you're hiring people into lower benefit tiers. We're taking into account the fact that investment advisors say investment return over the next decade will be lower than it's been. So we're taking all of that into account in our projections. And so slide 13, in your report prepared by CalPERS, CalPERS has a projection of where they think the rates are going to go. Point of fact, when we compare our projections with CalPERS in the short run, our numbers are lower. Why are they lower? They're lower really for two reasons. Reason number one is actual investment return subsequent to when the CalPERS report was prepared has been better than expected, so that drops the rates a little bit. And we're taking into account that you will be hiring some folks into those lower benefit tiers. Slide 14 is really our projection of your non-sworn safety, your miscellaneous employees over the next decade or so. So for your 17-18 year, 27.4% of pay. We're expecting that to grow to about 39% over the next decade on what we refer to as a 50% confidence level basis. What does that mean? What that means is we did a projection of various investment returns, applied those projected assets to contribution requirements, and half of them, 50% of them, resulted in rates that are higher than the green line. Half of them resulted in rates below the green line. And then you look at those hollow squares. For the hollow squares, 25% of our projections are higher than the rates you see in the hollow squares, and 75% below. Similarly, the solid squares, 75% above, 25% below. So think of that green line as sort of an expected contribution with the squares, hollow and solid, sort of a reasonable amount of volatility where rates might go over the next decade. So you really see a bit of volatility here in where rates are going to go. Slide 15. This is apology number 2. I've worn glasses since before I went to kindergarten. I can't read the numbers on this graph. So, however, what I want you to do is look at the pattern of the projection, in particular the projection of that green line. So here is the message you should take from this. Message is your contributions will be quite high in the short run, but if assumptions sort of play out as expected, we expect your contribution to gradually start to decline so plateau, if you will, in that middle period, and then gradually decline over a long period of time. What this means is ultimately your unfunded liability we expect will be paid off. Is there a guarantee it's going to look like that? No. But what I encourage people to think about is the big deal is where these numbers are going to go in the short run and what their impact is on your budget. So what we've done is taken that green line and split it into its components. The components are that light orange line, if you will. That's the value of benefits being earned during the year, the normal cost. And then the red line, that's the payment on the unfunded liability. And then if we take this information on slide 17, and you look at 1718, your total miscellaneous non-sworn safety contribution at about $2,670,000, and then you get out to 2829, you're sitting at about $5 million. So in about a decade, your non-sworn safety contribution will go from about 2.7 million to 5 million, a very big increase, almost certainly much more rapidly than your anticipated revenue growth. So again, for me, from a budget standpoint, I think where the contributions are going drives the conversation when it comes to CalPERS. So with your permission, I'm going to zip through just for a moment to get to slide 22. Slide 22 is your sworn safety contributions, about $2 million, $2.1 million in 1718, and about $4.8 million in 2829. Again, very big increase in the contribution over that period of time. When you combine those two together, what you really see is a growth rate that will begin to absorb more and more of your general fund budget over the next probably 15 years. And so that for me gets our clients asking the question, what are your options? And let me just be clear here. You do not have the option of going to CalPERS and say, charge us less. I'm not saying they'll laugh at you, but it's not going to be a very pleasant conversation if you ask that question. They're going to say clearly no to that. So when you think about what your options are, really your options are twofold. Take a look at where the rates are going to go and anticipate them in the budget and expect that you might have budget challenges. You might see your contributions eating more and more of your general fund budget. For me, though, a better solution is to look at what options you have, and every option you have beyond just letting them happen, they all involve money. There is no option, unfortunately, that does not involve money. And I think about that question of, what are your options? First question is, where do you get the money from? I'll tell you, I'll call it one-time amount. We have clients that view that one-time amount in a variety of different, some of them are getting settlements. Others look at their annual budgeting process and they go, oh, we had a budget surplus this year. Let's have a council policy that takes a portion of that budget surplus. Maybe a portion increases revenue, increases reserves. A portion goes to deal with one-time projects, and a portion to set aside for CalPERS. We have clients who have council policy that runs something like that: 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for those three items. Second item is, I refer to it as an annual amount. What we're really talking about here is, look, if your contribution is going to get to $5 or $6 million, why not start budgeting for a higher amount now and then a lower amount later? So sort of flattening, if you will, that curve on the contribution. And so that's really, we have clients who are absolutely doing that. Third option is you look at your existing reserves and you go, well, we aren't going to, some of these are unallocated. Maybe we could use some of that. I always refer to this as borrowing. The reason I refer to it as borrowing is because if you believe your reserves need to be at the level that they are, taking a portion of that, really you ought to think about paying that back over time. So you're borrowing from your reserves, you move that to take care of CalPERS, and ultimately you plan for getting those reserves back to what you think is an appropriate level. And then the fourth item, in the interest of full disclosure, I am not a fan of this particular option, but it's a pension obligation bond. A lot of folks are trying to convince public agencies that this is a wonderful idea, and if you don't dig into the details, it sounds like a wonderful idea, because what you're going to do is you're going to go out into the market, you're going to borrow at maybe 5%, and you turn around and give that money to CalPERS, and CalPERS says they think they're going to earn 7. So people go, borrow at 5, earn 7. What's not to like about that? Well, here's what's not to like about that. There is no guarantee that CalPERS will earn 7. If you had borrowed money and given it to CalPERS in October 2007 at the height of the market before the recession, you'd be seriously underwater today. There's also a couple of very technical components. So if you think about that contribution projection, by and large, if CalPERS investment return is bad, you lose that bet. And believe it or not, if investment return is particularly good, you actually lose that bet as well. And it's all about a section in PEPRA that does not allow you to get the benefit if investment return is particularly good. So those are your options. So once you get the money, the question is, what do you do with it? And your options really are give it directly to CalPERS, set up an internal service fund. If you give it directly to CalPERS, you lose some control over that. What you do, if you kind of think about that long-term green line that I couldn't read the numbers on, if you give it to CalPERS, you're really lowering that line sort of equally over that period. So when you think about from a budget standpoint, you might not need a reduction in your contribution 25 years from now. You might need it more in the next 15 to 20 years. You might not need it in the next 5. You might need it beyond 5. So you lose some flexibility in being able to apply that money to the years that you need it in. But when you, from a budget standpoint, if you look at where the contributions are going and you think you can afford it, and it's not going to have an adverse impact on your budget, giving it directly to CalPERS is a great option. Internal service fund, what you're doing is you're taking that money, putting it into an internal service fund. You are then limited on how you can invest that money. So you will, today, maybe you're getting 150 basis points on your money. A year ago, maybe you were getting less than 1% on your money. So it's really kind of all about setting it aside. If you move it into an internal service fund, that money is available to council to use for other things. If you set up a supplemental trust, sort of option number 3, what you're doing is moving it into that trust, and you're then tied. You have to use that money to either reimburse the town for contributions made or give it directly to CalPERS. So you can get an expected higher return than the town would get if you have an internal service fund. My expectation is you would likely get a lower return than CalPERS would. So that first option, directly to CalPERS, from a budget standpoint, when you look at those numbers, if you can afford that, that probably is a great option. On the other hand, you get much less flexibility with that money. And so the flexibility all comes in with the 115 trust or the internal service fund. With the 115 trust, you're able to get a higher expected return than internal service fund. So just very, very quickly, slide 25, the way the 115 trust might work for the town. This is really just an example of how it might work. Is you put an initial amount into the trust. Maybe you borrow, that's something you might borrow from reserves. You expect to get a return of maybe 5% on that money. And then what you do is you increase your budget amount. We happen to be looking at safety right here. So in this particular example, for 2021 budget year, you set your safety budget number at 60% of pay. CalPERS will be asking for 53.4. You take that difference and you move it into the supplemental trust. And then when CalPERS tells you they want a contribution higher than 60, what you do is you keep that 60 in your budget, and you take the difference between 60 and what CalPERS is asking for, and you give that to CalPERS directly from the 115 trust. So there's really a budget stabilization number. Sorry to
interject, but being mindful of the time, we have another meeting that'll start at 7, and I'd like to save a little time for our council members to ask questions if they desire.
I'm done.
Okay, questions from council members? Do we have another piece to his presentation, or this is it?
No, this concludes it. And the final item on your agenda, as John mentioned, you don't really have any control over CalPERS, but we wanted this body to be aware that the 2017 pension valuations for both the miscellaneous plan and the safety plan are available. But there's no real action on that other than just accepting the reports. So this is really the majority of the items tonight.
Okay. So I guess I just want to make one comment on this last slide. I like the idea of budget stabilization, and you said another way to look at it is you said keep 60% from our budget, and that really means we're paying this payment out of our general fund revenues, and we're paying the other delta out of our investment fund, basically. So it allows us to limit what if our general fund revenues aren't growing to keep up with the green line, we then are able to pull out of our investment fund to make up for that.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. Other questions on that? Councilmember Jensen.
It's actually just a procedural question. Were there any more motions required from the council?
Do you need a motion for us to accept the report?
This was actually more of an informational presentation, so this is just to review and discuss, as you've done. The next item is agendized as review and accept, but once again, you have no real governance control over those documents. It's just accepting that you're aware that the 2017 valuations exist.
Okay, other questions? If not, seeing none, I guess I need to open the verbal communications for this portion of the meeting. Would any member of the public wish to address us on this agenda item? Seeing nobody coming forward, I'll close the verbal communication. And then I believe we are finished with this agenda item, and I will adjourn